questions, if there's one thing I like to get across to students is make sure that you're answering what the question is asking. Use I statements. Another big one there. I did this. I chose to do this. I learned about. Make it about yourself, right? This is kind of like your opportunity to boast, right? Because this is ultimately your application, and we want to hear about you. So what exactly is the purpose of the PIQs, right? So one, it completes the application, right? So this is to emphasize how PIQs either stand well on their own by providing new information that can be found elsewhere in the application, right? Because at this point, like we've seen your grades, you've reported your grades to us, we've seen what we need to see on the academic aspect, and now we want to, like Brian mentioned earlier, see what makes you, right? They do act, or they lend themselves well to like supporting what may be said in other parts of your application, right? So maybe in other parts of your extracurricular activities or special programs or academics, right? Or things of that nature. So again, what is the purpose of the PIQ? So self-advocacy, right? So Brian's going to go into a little bit more detail on some of these bubbles, but self-advocacy. So telling us, or showing us, I should say, how you stand out, right? How you stand out, not necessarily in terms of how you're better than everyone else, right? But how you're showing us that I'm boasting about myself here. And then context, right? So context within the application itself, all the things that you've already written, like I kind of already previously stated, it adds context to your application, and giving us just that little bit more. And then it sets students apart, right? These PIQs, it's us getting to know you more than just, like I keep saying, more than just your grades.
Okay, so let's go a little more further into, what we're kind of looking about. When we talk about self-advocacy, what's kind of the idea? And I know, generationally and personally, sometimes it might be hard to talk about yourself. And I totally get that. I'm not a person that likes to brag about myself. I'm very humble. I try to stay out of the spotlight in a lot of ways. But in a lot of ways, you have to treat the PIQs like a newspaper headline. You have to advocate for yourself. You have to kind of find your own voice and focus of what makes you unique. And that's the way to come across in that way. Since the UC's here, we don't interview you. We don't have letters of recommendation. We don't take any of that type of stuff. This is really the opportunity for you to kind of talk about yourself and tell us, basically what makes you kind of stand out and what makes you, a really strong applicant in that way. The way I kind of look at it is that this is our interview. So even though we don't do formal interviews because we get way too many applications, obviously the UCs are very popular where we get 100,000 applications every single year. We can't interview every single student. So I always like to say, treat the PIQs like an interview. Treat it as if me or Caesar was sitting across from you on a Zoom or in person, and we asked you one of the PIQs. How would you answer that back? You're not going to start off with like a formal essay. You're not going to quote and say, well, Abraham Lincoln once said, you don't talk to anyone like that in an interview. So the idea is to come across and just say, jump into it yourself. Talk about yourself like that interview. Treat it like you're talking to us in person, and use that type of language and use that tone of voice with it. We don't care about what Abraham Lincoln said. He's dead and he's not you. We want to know what you say. So that's the idea when we talk about self-advocacy, is that you only have 350 words. So don't waste your time talking about someone else's words. We want to hear your own words on this topic. The other thing to kind of go into is, how do you kind of are set apart from this? What makes you obviously you, and what makes you unique? This is your chance, again, to talk about your story. It's a chance to add depth to something that is already important to you. So it's not necessarily, we'll talk about common mistakes and things, but it's not necessarily highlighting things that we already know outside in the application. We want to know a little more in depth of what's happening. And so, yes, everyone can be, a standout athlete or a really wonderful performer, right? But we don't know what are the steps that it took to get to those places. So it's not necessarily answering the question of the outcomes of everything, but talk about the process. How did you personally get there? Because everyone's process is a little different. So it's not about, okay, yes, I was the star athlete on this team or whatever, and we got all these awards. It's going to be about, okay, I spent the summer 40 hours a week training with so-and-so, or I spent this many years in a ballet theater company and we did this many performances and that stuff. That's what makes you stand out. So when we talk about the PIQs, we're asking you to go into the process of everything. Don't talk about the outcomes. We can already see the outcomes. We see it from the extracurricular activities. We see it from the grades. We see it from your test scores and all that stuff. We see your AP test. We see the outcome of the work, but it's how you got to that point, how you're thinking about it. When you talk about your interest in a specific major, don't say, I'm very interested in being an environmental major, but talk about how you arrived at that point. Maybe you wanted to get involved with beach cleanups. Maybe you started recycling programs. You noticed a problem and you did that. So again, it's really describing the process of how you got to these kind of conclusions, or the process of how you got to the outcome. That's when it's going to make you you. Again, everyone can maybe talk about similar outcomes and awards and all these things, but it's really going to be the process that got you there, because that's going to be unique to you. Not everyone's going to have the same process of how you arrived to that conclusion. So that's what you want to be able to kind of advocate and explain to us through these PIQs here. And so when Caesar was talking about, I'm going to answer 4 out of the 8 questions, this is where you can do that. Now, you can always email the questions to yourself. My recommendation is to email it to you and compose them outside of the application, because you don't want to be doing it right when you're live on the application. You want to definitely take your time to think about it. So my recommendation, copy these questions outside into like a word processor, a document outside that you can just cut and paste. And then when you're ready to submit the application, cut and paste them back in. But type them outside, that way you'll have a chance to work on them. You can review it. You can think about it. You don't have to stay online for it all. When you look at the questions, though, again, these are all very open-ended questions. So when we look at the 8 questions that we're asking, right? Describe an example of your leadership experience in which you have positively influenced others, help resolve disputes, or contributed to groups over time, right? Every person has a creative side. It can be expressed in many different ways. Describe how you express your creative side. What would you say is your greatest talent or skill? How have you developed or demonstrated that talent over time? As you can kind of see here, the question sometimes there's multifaceted, there's multi-answers to it. It's not just about listing what you've done, but there's going to be the second question usually of, how have you developed or how have you demonstrated it out over time? So make sure that when you look at these questions, you're actually reading the entire question and seeing, okay, what are we really trying to get at? It's not necessarily the first question that we're asking, but it's going to be the second part of it, right? Describe how you have furthered this interest inside or outside of the classroom with an academic subject that inspires you, right? So don't just talk about, again, you're interested in environmental science, but the idea is the PIQ is to answer how you have furthered that interest into those things. I usually like to say the last question, number 8, beyond what's already been shared. That's really kind of our really open-ended one, where I'd say, like, this is kind of the really, if there's something you really want to tell us, something that you're really proud of, something that you have, something that you want us to know and you want to use that as a PIQ answer, this is kind of that open-ended response, right? What makes you a strong candidate for the admission to the University of California? That's really the purpose of number 8. So again, just to reiterate, there's no formula for which ones you pick. You're just going to pick 4 of them. And usually I would like to pick the 4 that relate to the strongest things that you have to share to us. So when you kind of look back at your high school career, the top 4 or 5 things that you want an admissions person officer to know, that's how you want to kind of relate to PIQs. Because again, they're so open-ended, they're so general that you can pretty much fit most responses into any of these questions in that way. We're not necessarily looking to see how much you are answering the question, but more of, okay, what new information or what information are we getting from you from these PIQs right here? All
right. So some of the things, common mistakes that we try to have students avoid within their personal, when responding to their personal insight questions. So Brian kind of mentioned this one a little bit earlier. So the use of quotes and, and thoughts of other people. So, don't open with the quote. I know I remember writing papers in high school where the first thing that I did was write a quote, right? And it was an essay. And like I said, this isn't an essay, so we don't have to hear a quote. We want to hear what you think. I liked what Brian said, and it made me laugh earlier. No one cares what he said because he's dead, and we want to hear about you. That was really funny, but it's true. It's true. This is your time to shine, right? So tell us your thoughts. Definitely don't waste 350 words with words from someone else. Discuss in detail the tragic loss of your goldfish at the age of 4 and how that taught you to deal with grief. I think we've probably all lost a pet in the as the children, but it's important to think of the time frame of things, right? We want to see who you are in the here and the now, right? We want to know what's going on through your brain and what are your thoughts now, right? Not something that happened when you were 4 years old, right? Definitely don't manufacture hardship. Don't think that you need to create or write a story about hardship because you think like I this is not good enough, or I need more, so I'm going to make something up, right? Definitely don't do that. Repeating the same situation when we already know about it. From previous experience, like reading students PIQs, especially when I was a counselor, I would see that students would use the same situation, repeatedly, maybe 2 or even 3 times for different PIQ responses. Try to avoid that, avoid the repetition because, once you said it once, there's really, no point to say it again. I know sometimes it's like, well, it makes sense because it's, it's connecting to this, this PIQ connects to that experience again, but, try to tell us something new, right? Try to tell us something that we haven't yet. And then don't create a continuation of the first PIQ, right? So if you write about something in the first PIQ, make sure the next one's, different. It's not continuation of that same story. Talk about parents, grandparents, siblings, significant others for 300 words. I know for a lot of us, family is a big, it's a big deal. Our friends are a big deal for us, right? And we care about them. But going back to it, keep in mind that although their stories might be inspiring, we want to hear about you. We want to hear about your story. So don't waste your word count telling us something about someone else's story. So, remember your voice, your story.
All right. The next one is really, don't try to be funny or use crude humor. Remember, you are writing to complete strangers who cannot react to you. And so the way that you use this, it kind of tells you a little bit about yourself. Don't try to be funny. I think about in the past, one of the weirdest ones I ever read was basically a student compared himself to a Chipotle burrito and basically said, I'm a Chipotle burrito and here's all my parts and stuff like that. I was the chicken, something was the rice and beans, and something about the tortilla and the sour cream and salsa. And it didn't have anything to do with the application. It was like, I knew you were trying to be funny. I knew you were trying to be creative to stand out, but it really just didn't help. Another one was a student who said, I'm an alien. And they thought, to send like, I'm an alien who's trapped in a 17-year-old body from Northern California. And I'm observing your culture and people by embodying, what it means to be a teenager. It's like, okay, hilarious. But again, just not necessary for a PIQ. The idea is that if you are a creative person, if you are someone who likes to stand out in your writing, your normal writing will connote that. It'll communicate that to us. We will be able to understand and see your creativity just in the way you respond. So you don't have to manufacture these kind of really funny or witty responses. Not to mention, you don't need to curse at anyone or use inappropriate language in that. I've heard very many graphic novels that almost like a romance novel that I'd rather not see with my own eyes. If you can't show your parents this, I probably wouldn't show this to anyone else. So just again, you don't need to try to be funny in order to stand out. Like, we are already going to be reading the application. I know the first thing that English teachers tell you is that, okay, you got to draw the reader in. You got to, put something funny. You got to do something to keep our attention. Here's a really big, reality. Caesar and I, this is our job. Our job is to read your application. So you already have our attention. This is part of the process of how we're going to review you to see if you're going to be selected. So you don't have to worry about us being bored and like, okay, we're not interested. We're going to pass it on. We are going to read your application. We read it multiple times. It's not just one reader. So definitely know that you don't have to use humor or crude jokes in order to get our attention. we will absolutely read every part of your application. And so that's why just get to the point, answer the questions. Number 6, don't try to impress us by seeing how well your SAT vocabulary is, or try to be, pretending you're like an SAT like teacher. We don't need to see big words. Half the time, if I don't understand the word, how am I expecting you to actually understand the right context either? And so again, the idea is write in your own voice and language. Just take the time to pretend, okay, we were sitting across from you. We were on Zoom together and we're talking live. Would you really use SAT words back to me in that way? Now, okay, some of you, the 1%